I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon.
You got to move. You gotta move. You got to move. You got to move. You got to move, child. You got to move. Gotta move. 'Cause when the Lord gets ready.
Okay, I am going to read you now from the Gospel according to Mark, the 6th chapter. I'm reading verses 1 through 6. Jesus came to his own hometown, and his disciples came along with him. And when Sabbath arrived, he began to teach in the synagogue. And the many people there listening were astonished, and they were saying, well, where did this man get these things from? This wisdom given to him and the miracles performed by his hands. Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here among us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household. And he could do no miracles there except that he laid his hands upon a few sick people and healed them, and he marveled at their unbelief. Somewhere between the year 65 AD and 70 AD, in Rome during a time of persecution, when Christians were being persecuted pretty severely, when the leadership in the church, many of them have already been killed, like Peter and Paul and some of the other important early Christian founders. There was a guy named Mark. Mark had been an associate of Paul for a while. They had a falling out, and then later on he came to be an associate of Peter. And so he was like Peter's secretary. And so he knew the stories. He'd heard the stories. The whole Christian community knew the stories. They would tell these stories. It's predominantly an oral society, so remembering and telling stories is very important, and repeating them accurately is very important. So like if you and I played that game Telephone, do you ever play that game, right? What starts and what ends wildly different, but in the ancient world, they wouldn't have changed very much at all because they had to be accurate. They had to have it right. So in a society of oral tradition, repeating a story, passing on information, remembering a contract or a deal that's been negotiated, because it's not written down, you have to have a couple of witnesses, they have to hear it and repeat it and have it right, and you have to be able to call on them years later if there's a dispute, and they have to be able to remember what it was. So they were good at this. There were people who could write and read, but population-wise, that was maybe 25%, and those people were in high demand. If you could read or write, you were automatically going to be in a better social status. And if you could write neatly, what was called a scribe's hand, then, oh my goodness, you had work. So scribes were highly sought after because any written documentation had to be legible to everybody. And so to be able to write that way is really important. So reading, writing, text, very important, but not everyone has access, so people have to be able to memorize and to repeat what they've heard. So the stories of Jesus, which had never been written down, were being repeated. There's a whole bunch of stories being repeated. There's groups of it, chunks of it. Now, it's possible that somebody had written down some of the sayings and stories of Jesus and that was being passed around, but that's unclear. But there was a lot of information that people knew. So Mark obviously heard all of these stories, but he knew Peter personally, and Peter's an eyewitness, so he also got stories from Peter. And after Peter died, Mark puts it together in what we call the Gospel of Mark. He wasn't there, so he doesn't necessarily know what order things came in. He hears the stories, but he doesn't know what order the stories come in necessarily. I mean, obviously the crucifixion and resurrection are at the end. The beginning is the baptism. So he organizes it as best he can, but he's not trying to organize it chronologically, exactly, only in a broad sense. What he's doing is he's writing a sermon. The story that he's telling, the story of Jesus, what we call the Gospel of Mark, is essentially a sermon written for the congregations in Rome, these poor Christians who are being persecuted, who are meeting in secret, underground or in people's houses where they're slipping in the dark of night so they can have a worship gathering. And he's doing it for them, and so he's telling the story. A lot of it they've heard before. He's telling it in a way, he's writing it down, and it's supposed to be read out loud in the church. That's how it's supposed to go. But he doesn't know he's writing the gospel according to Mark. And that's important for you to get. He has no idea, right? He's just thinking about his local congregation. But it catches on, gets copied, passed around, copied by hand, by the way, no Xerox machines, passed around. So pretty soon other people are reading it. Eventually, and by eventually I mean within a decade, 20 years at the most, but 10 to 15 years later, I would say, Mark's gospel has found its way into the hands of the writer of the Gospel of Matthew and also the writer of the Gospel of Luke. And so they start with Mark's gospel as a template and then add stuff, change stuff. So this is sort of the framework that we're working in. Now, most of the time, that's the kind of stuff that scholars love to talk about. Scholars love to whatever. And when I was in seminary, they said, "Well, don't tell this to your congregations. They can't handle the truth." Right? Okay, so they didn't quite quote that movie, but that was what they said. Don't talk about this. Congregations are not ready for this. Yeah, you're not that dumb. You can handle this. This is just how the process comes to be. So, and here's why it's incredibly useful. When Matthew, for example, gets his hands on Mark's gospel and starts to write his own gospel, and he's making whatever changes and adjustments in the storytelling, that says something. If I see that Matthew, for example, has made some change, I go, well, oh, so here's Mark, where he's working from. Here's the change Matthew's made. Why is he doing that? Does that tell me something about what Matthew's trying to say? Maybe differently than the point Mark is trying. Because remember, Mark's got a point he's trying to make to his community in Rome. But maybe Matthew has a different point that he's trying to make. And so he might tell the story differently to convey a different idea. And I can see that, or at least more get at that a little better, because I see the differences. I see the changes. Sometimes what happens is something that Mark writes gets changed by both Matthew and Luke. And when that happens, it causes me to go, why did they change Mark? What is it about what Mark said that bothered them so much? And I'm forced to not figure out what Luke is trying to get at or what Matthew's trying to get at, but it forces me to go back and look at Mark and see something that I might have missed. And this is an example of that. Jesus comes to Nazereth, where he grows up. And he goes into the synagogue. This was his custom, going to the synagogue on Sabbath day, which is Saturday, not Sunday, but we'll pretend for the sake of the sermon that he goes to church on Sunday. And he has the opportunity to speak, oh, well, we have a special guest speaker who's asked if he can share a word with us. And so he reads, he does some kind of something. And Mark doesn't tell us, it just says he comes, everyone is very impressed. And then they start to have a different, they said, wait a second. Because at first it's like, where did this guy get this knowledge and this wisdom? This is amazing. And this power, the miracles he's been doing. Wow. And then someone goes, wait a minute. Ain't that the carpenter, Mary's kid, brother of Joseph and James and these other guys? And his sisters, don't we know his sisters too? Now, when I read the Gospel of Mark, I see these words. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, whose brothers and sisters are these people? Luke, when he tells the story, he like most of what Mark says, he just ignores. He has another thing. He actually wants to tell what Jesus talked about in the synagogue, and it's really cool. But in the middle of it, he does refer to exactly what Mark said. And the people are saying, wait, isn't this the son of Joseph? If I trot over to Matthew's gospel it follows Mark pretty close, but when it comes to their response, like, wait a second, they say in Matthew's gospel, isn't this the son of the carpenter? Is not his mother named Mary? And I see this and I go, okay, what's the problem here? And then it hits me like ding. See, in the ancient world, let's Forget ancient world. How about Iceland or Finland or many parts of Russia? You are named for your father. So if your dad is named Johann and you live like in Scandinavia, your name it would be either daughter of Johann or son of Johann. In other words, it would be Johann's son or Johann's daughter. If you go into Russia, the way they say it there is Johann's son is Ivanovich, Johann's daughter is Ivanova. So you have a specific different ending. Boy or girl, but named for the dad. For the dad, because everyone knows who mom's is, right? Everyone knows who the mom is, so you name for the dad. No one would ever say mom's daughter, mom's son. That's just not how naming works in these cultures. And it's no different in this period of time in the ancient world. This is about the Jesus visit to home, maybe the year 27 or 28, somewhere AD, somewhere in there. He goes home and they say, isn't this the son of Mary? Now that's a Greek way of putting what in Hebrew would have been Ben Miriam, and in Aramaic, which was the common speech of the day, Bar Mariam. So isn't this Bar Mariam, Miriam's son, Mary's son? So they refer to him as the carpenter, Mary's son. And when you read that, it's easy not to think anything of it until you read it again in their culture, and suddenly you realize what they're saying is, ain't this Mary's kid, if you know what I mean, right? Not Joseph's kid, Mary's kid. Isn't this Mary's kid? The scandal was out there. They knew Joseph was not really the dad of Jesus. They knew that. We talk about it every Christmas. I mean, it's just part of the Christmas story for us. We don't even think about it. For them, it's scandal. Woo! Oh! And so here this guy, who is the illegitimate child of Mary from their standpoint, is like, he is acting uppity in the synagogue. What's he doing? Coming to church acting like he knows this stuff, like he's all wise and preachy, and who does he think he is? He's just Mary's illegitimate kid. I'm not using the B word, but you understand the B word is implied, if not stated explicitly. And they're oh, this is what? That's just inappropriate. Not only that, but he's got brothers and sisters, and we know them, and none of them are special. Why does he think he's special? And not only that, we know he's a carpenter. By the way, carpenter, don't think guy who makes furniture, think guy who builds houses, general contractor, something along those lines. So Jesus probably ran a business, was used to hiring laborers to work and running jobs. But that means, someone's like, he built my garage. Did a pretty good job too. I think I'd have him come and do it again. But who does he think he is? He worked for me. I paid him. He worked for me. And now he's up here going, oh, God says this, God says that. We get from Luke, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. That's the scripture he reads. And he says this today, this is fulfilled in your hearing. I'm like, oh my goodness, who does he think he is? Who does he think he is? And they are offended. And I love that the Greek word, so technically the direct translation is, and they stumbled. So the Greek word is stumble. But what's interesting about the word for stumble is that it is the word scandal. The English word scandal comes directly from this Greek word. So when I can't help it, I'm like, and they were scandalized by him. It's a scandal. Oh my goodness. We got to go tell and the gossip starts a-flying. The scandal of the birth of this one. Who does Mary's illegitimate kid think he is? And that's what's going on. And so the story has this very remarkable ending too. So in Luke's telling of the story, Jesus just irritates them in the synagogue so badly that they throw him out of town. And the mob, he kind of has to slip through the crowd and escape. In Matthew's telling of the story, it ends this way, and Jesus did not do many miracles there other than maybe healing a couple people. But here's the way Mark puts it, the thing they changed. Mark says this, and he was unable to perform any mighty works there. And he marveled at their disbelief. And that's actually, I mean, that's important. You and I don't want to say we've got the power, but we have the authority and the capacity to shut ourselves off from the power of God. We can do that. Part of it's because God can certainly do whatever God wants, but God chooses never to violate our free will. And so if we choose that we will never believe, if we choose to close ourselves off to possibility, if we choose to say, I will not believe, then that stops it right there. That disbelief, not just unbelief. You can be an unbeliever, like, I don't really believe this, but be open to the possibility that there's more than you know. But when you sure you know what's going on and you refuse to believe anything else because you know how it is and you lock that down, you cut yourself off from the power of God. That's what's happening here. They cut themselves off from the power of God. So no miracles happened other than a few people who had enough faith received healing. And that's really remarkable. And you can see why Matthew, uncomfortable with that idea, didn't want to put Jesus in the position of sounding like he was suddenly, straitjacketed by their disbelief. So he just says, and he did not perform many. But Luke is very clear. He was unable. Not Luke, Mark. Mark is very clear. He was unable. Their disbelief is that it was just like a wall. And that's important because that means that that's true for us too. We can shut ourselves off from the grace and power of God. We can just do it. So this story to me is really important because, I've given you its historical context now. I just told you the story in 27 AD, but now let's kind of zoom back a little bit. See, the essence of our Christian theology is that in order for us to know the God who is ultimately unknowable, God creates common ground with us by becoming human, by becoming one of us. That's who Jesus is. He is God who becomes human. And the understanding of that theological idea, I know it hurts the head, doesn't it? Just kind of makes you want to go like this. I should, whenever I talk about the incarnation or the Trinity, those two doctrines, I should always come with Tylenol. Right? It's like, take one before the sermon. It's hard to wrap our minds around, but as the theologians struggled with this and tried to, what are we trying to say? What are we trying to say? They ended up saying this ultimately. Jesus is in every way fully God and in every way fully human. He's a fully human being. And we don't have trouble as modern Christians with the idea of him being fully God. We have trouble with the idea of him being fully human. We want to think that when Jesus, after a hard day of work, he's working really hard and he's all sweaty and he comes back and as he walks through the crowd, people are going, smells like someone's baking chocolate chip cookies, right? That's what we want to imagine. Like somehow there's something extraordinary about the humanity of Jesus. Like, oh, he was a genius. I've actually heard people say that Jesus was a genius. I don't know if he was a genius. What I know is that he was a human being, just like any of us. The humanity of Jesus is absolutely essential to understanding what the whole story is about, as is the divinity. God becomes one of us. Ordinary life, an ordinary human life, unremarkable, if it wasn't for the fact that Jesus stepped into the role of Messiah, which is why he came, that death had that power. The first 30 years of his life, we know almost nothing about. We know a little bit about his birth, where he was born, Bethlehem, the scandal surrounding his birth, the messages from angels. We got some of the story. We know that at one point they were in Egypt because Herod was trying to kill everybody, so they escaped to Egypt. We know about an encounter that when Jesus was getting ready for his confirmation, bar mitzvah, whatever it was back then, and how his parents lost him, and he was busy doing theology with the teachers of the law, and they're looking for him everywhere, and he's there in the temple. So that's about it. We know almost nothing. We know he was a carpenter. That's it. How's that? His life up to that point is like completely unremarkable. It's completely ordinary. It could be any of us. And that's in some ways the point, right? Any of us, I don't know about you, but I never expect that I will be on the cover of People magazine. I will never be Times Person of the Year, right? I'm never going to be interviewed for some national whatever. It'll never happen. I'm never going to win a Tony or an Oscar or a SAG Award or a Grammy or a Golden Globe, or have I gone through the whole list now? Right? That's just not going to happen. EGOT, isn't it EGOT? Emmy, Globe, Oscar, Tony. Yep, that's it. That's the EGOT. That's like the ultimate. It'll never happen, right? Never happen. Just ordinary people, you and I. That's all. We're just ordinary folks making our way through life. We're ordinary folks. We eat ordinary food. Our lives are ordinary lives. We encounter people. We have ordinary encounters with people. And it never occurs to us that the power of God can be present, manifest, and working in all of that ordinariness. You know, we keep thinking it's got it. That's why the TV preachers so often are like, they have the fancy suits and the Rolexes. You know, like it's like they got to be bigger than life, right? So they have their own airplanes and stuff like that. The Lord has told me that you should provide me another airplane so that I can fly and do the Lord's work. You know, right? Because they have to be bigger than life, richer, more powerful, more whatever, as if that's what makes it real. Now, how about this? The power of God is at work in the ordinary, you and me, ordinary people, ordinary touch. You don't have any idea. You might sit and talk to somebody and have no idea, just listening to them for a few minutes because they're having a rough day. And then oh, I got to go now. There's my bus. And you walk away. And that person's life, they may have received grace from God directly because of you, because of that ordinary encounter. And you don't even think anything of it. You might have wrapped your arms around someone and given them a hug because they needed it. Or invited somebody to sit with you at the table at lunch at school, who otherwise wouldn't have been invited. And in this way, God's grace and power is at work, and you had no idea. You thought you were just being nice. Because in the ordinariness of flesh and blood is where God has chosen to work. Ordinary people. Remember, it was just Ash Wednesday. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Remember, O mortal, that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Dust, right? Or as Carl Sagan used to say, we are star stuff, right? This ordinary stuff God is working through. And if we're just open to the possibilities of what God is doing, if we don't shut ourselves off to it, God can do amazing, miraculous even things in people's lives. And sometimes we will never know. Later on, we might find out. I know I've had that experience, and I bet you will, or if you haven't already, someone will remember, will tell a story, either about you or maybe about your relative. Oh, your dad once, when this happened to me, and your dad did this, and it just changed my life. And Dad never spoke of it, never even thought about it again. It was the nice thing to do. Or Mom, I remember your mom, she would always invite us in. I always felt welcome in her house, right? And she never thought about it. She was just like, oh, we got another kid for the table. Great. How am I going to stretch the food? Right? And in all of these ordinary acts, something extraordinary occurs. And at the heart of this story of Jesus, what offends the holy people in church when Jesus is there is how ordinary he is, and yet how much power is manifest in that ordinary. Do you remember the singer Harry Chapin, right? No, you don't. Okay, us old folk, we remember Harry. Yeah. So Harry Chapin wrote the music for a musical based on what was called the Cotton Patch Gospels. So the Cotton Patch Gospel tells the story. It's the Gospel of Matthew, told as if everything happened in Georgia in the 1950s. So Jesus is not crucified, he's lynched. That's how that goes. So that's the telling of the story. It's great. And then this musical is written, and Harry Chapin writes the music. And one of the songs has this line, and it's right towards the end. It's kind of there as they're building into the finale. And I can never quote it. I actually have to sing it, so I apologize. So if a man tried to take his time on earth and see before he died what one life could be worth, oh, I wonder what would happen to this world. Right? What would happen if just one man, just one woman? Well, we've seen what can happen because we've watched not only in the life of Jesus, but how many other people, ordinary folks, have you seen who've done something that has altered the whole planet just for a moment? A woman who sits down on a bus changes the shape of a nation, right? You understand how these things are? This stuff is unexpectedly powerful. When a person says, I want to see what will happen, to see what one life can be worth, live my life that way, what can happen? How can the world change? That's the world is not changed by the bombs, just destroyed by the bombs, right? It's changed by the people who are willing to do the ordinary things, but to ask the question, what is one life worth? How does God work in this ordinary moment? And are ready to see the extraordinary happen. And that, in the end, that's you. That's me. That's us in this little teeny country church in a cornfield in Minnesota. And that's the good news. Oh, Jesus, scandal of Nazareth, help me to see your divine presence in the familiar. Your humanity only thinly veils your divinity. Yet how easily I let that veil obscure my sight of you. You have emptied yourself of glory to reach me in the dust, in the ash, in the plain and in the common. Because you come in the simple and ordinary, you reach me in my ordinariness. Ordinary flesh, ordinary words, ordinary touch, ordinary work, the dust that returns to dust. These come bearing love divine and transcendent. So do not let me be offended, scandalized by the common and ordinary, but let me find there what is the precious and extraordinary. Amen. We'd love to have you join us for Sunday worship at 8:30 at the Christ United Methodist Church or 10:15 at the Stanton United Methodist Church. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
When the Lord gets ready, you got to move. Oh, you